Good afternoon and welcome to this session of the Procedure Committee. This afternoon we're talking about our elections within the House of Commons inquiry, and we are specifically focusing on Select Committee chair elections. In this inquiry we're looking at the operation of Select Committee chair elections, including the voting systems, the competitiveness of these elections and canvassing by candidates. To help us with our inquiry, we are joined today by three academic experts. We have Professor Meg Russell, Dr. Stephen Holden-Bates and Dr. Mark Geddes. Good afternoon to you all. Before we begin, could I ask you to introduce yourselves formally for the record, starting with Professor Russell.
I'm Professor Meg Russell. I'm the Director of the Constitution Unit at University College London, and it might be worth throwing in that I was the Specialist Advisor to the Right Committee, which obviously devised the proposals for elected chairs.
Hi, I'm Dr. Mark Geddes. I'm a Senior Lecturer in Politics at the University of Edinburgh.
Hi, I'm Stephen Holden-Bates. I'm a Senior Lecturer in Political Science at the University of Birmingham.
Welcome to all three of you, and as is traditional, the first question comes from myself as Chair, and if I can ask you, Meg, the Constitution Unit has written evidence to us that suggests that the voting system for Select Committee chairs is set up to find candidates who can command the support of the majority of members of the House of Commons. Can you set out how the mechanics of the voting system work and how the underlying logic is to achieve that outcome?
Okay. I should maybe point out that the written evidence came from three colleagues. I was the first author, but it was also written with Alan Rennick, who is a deep electoral systems expert, and Tom Fleming. But as to how the election system works, basically you've been talking about the Deputy Speaker elections up until this point, I believe, and those are a bit more complicated because you're electing several people at once. On these, you're just electing one person at once, which means you can use a relatively simpler electoral system, which is the alternative vote system. And the principle is that each person chosen should have majority support. So, as you all know, but I guess this is for the record, nominations are opened, and if there is more than one person nominated for a committee, then a vote is held and voters will rank candidates in their order of preference. If after the first preferences are counted, no candidate has more than 50%, then the least popular candidate is eliminated and their second preferences are reallocated. And what that does, I mean, you've basically got two choices in an election like that, although Alan would probably tell me there are lots of more complicated, obscure ones, but first past the post and AV. And the difficulty with first past the post is that if you've got 3, 4, 5 candidates, it becomes a bit random and who gets through. You could get somebody elected on sort of 25% of the vote or something. And given that this isn't an election between parties, it's an election between people from the same party, you're not going to get sort of partisan advantage to a smaller party by swinging in behind a particular candidate. I think in each election, the things to choose between the candidates is going to be quite specific to that committee and that set of candidates. So I don't think that having that kind of system gives any kind of disproportionate influence to any particular group, but it does ensure that each person has the support of a majority of voters when forced to choose. The evidence from Ian McLean points out some of the shortcomings. The written evidence from Ian McLean, who's an even bigger electoral systems expert, if that's possible, than Alan Rennick, points out that in a vote, in a first past the post system ballot, you can have a situation where candidate A is more popular than candidate B. Candidate B would beat candidate C, but candidate C would actually beat candidate A. And so if you use second preferences, you can make sure that at least the last person has got some majority support, even if it uses second preferences. Sorry, that was probably a long and complicated answer.
No, that was an excellent explanation. And obviously, drawing on your experience with the Right Committee, how important is it that the positions of committee chairs are elected, in your view?
Well, it's important, I think, because it's a long time ago now, you know, and there aren't that many members of the House who were around in those days. It's worthwhile remembering what the system used to be, because I think when we look back at what it used to be, it looks quite peculiar. That in the old days, the basically the whips put forward names to be on each committee, and it was clear, they would make clear to those that they were nominating who they expected the chair to be from among those members, and that was sort of an expectation that if you went on the committee you would vote for that person. So it was very, very controlled by the whips and therefore by the party leaders, and the system fell apart back after the 2001 election, when the whips kept off the previous members, the previous chairs of two committees, Gwyneth Dunwoody and Donald Anderson, and when the names went before the Parliamentary Labour Party for kind of information that they were about to be put on the order paper, all hell broke loose. And I was actually there because I was working for Robin Cook as Leader of the House at the time. Gwyneth Dunwoody stood up and said, "Why is my name not on this list?" And the lists ended up being rejected by the House because the chairs had been kept off. And the system became very controversial for a number of years after that. There were a series of proposals from the Liaison Committee, from the Modernisation Committee, and it was still rumbling on in 2009 when the Right Committee met. And the principle that the Right Committee was seeking to honour was, I've got its bits from its report here, it should be for the House and not for the Executive to choose which of its members should scrutinise the Executive. The House should also have a strong, if not decisive, influence on the identity of the chair. It does have a decisive influence. The credibility of select committees could be enhanced by a greater and more visible element of democracy in the election of members and chairs. And I think that most people agree, and my colleagues probably want to comment on this as well, that the image of the committees and the strength and influence of committees has been very much enhanced by those reforms, because they're seen as much more independent of the executive, even though I think they did a good job before, to be honest. But also the chairs in particular are seen as speaking for the House. They're not seen as, there's a risk that even chairs who were independent in the past might have been accused of being some sort of lackey of the whips or something. You cannot deny that people have been chosen by the House, and that gives them status and independence, and enhances, I think, the reputation of Parliament as a whole.
Gavin, do you have a follow-up?
Can I just come in on this point? Because I think it's an interesting point that you raise. I think do you not think opposition to parties are at a disadvantage, though, potentially at the system? Because I certainly know that it'd be the inclination of a government chief whip to do everything they can do to get the weakest horse in on as a select committee chair, and sort of encourage their voters and their party, because you obviously always have a majority, or you would usually have a majority as government, to make sure that you have the weakest possible chair from the opposition benches as against the strongest chair. Whereas if you're an opposition chief whip, you put the person who's most likely to cause the maximum amount of pain to the government as against...
Maybe in that case, I get your point, and I think there are some dangers...
That's what happens.
There are some dangers of that kind, but I think maybe then is it maybe for the opposition chief whip to try and keep the weaker candidates off the ballot paper so that the governing party doesn't elect them? I mean, there are lots of political dynamics.
It's a guided democracy.
Sorry?
It's a guided democracy.
I also think it's a bit too cynical to think that all government backbenchers want weak select committee chairs and weak scrutiny of the government. I think I would
usually want weak scrutiny of the government from the opposition chairs.
Well, they can only choose a weak opposition chair if weak opposition members put themselves forward to be chair, and I would have thought that quite a lot of them wouldn't want a weak chair of any committee, but maybe I'm too naive, or maybe you're too cynical, or probably the truth is somewhere in the middle.
So
it's not always the preferred candidate who wins in a select committee chair election, and I think we've probably all got examples of that. John, do you have some questions?
Yes, thanks, Kat. Do you think the voting system, Professor Russell, that you described so well, is it clear to the general public and clear to MPs participating in the election?
I'm hogging all the time.
Or, whoever feels best able to answer.
We may all have an answer on this. I think it's probably as clear as it could be. You know, I mean, the public are never going to have a very high awareness of how people are chosen, but I think they know that they are elected, which is an important thing. And I doubt that many of them delve into the fine details of the electoral system. But, I mean, this is an obvious point which somebody is going to make at some point. Even if members of the public don't use AV to choose MPs, it is commonly used in other places, particularly inside the political parties, to choose leaders. So it's not a completely unfamiliar system, but I doubt that the majority of the public want to get into the weeds of exactly how people are chosen. I think they're probably interested in the fact that they have been chosen by the House.
Yeah. So to add to that, I think I would echo the point that Professor Russell has made, that it's not necessarily how those MPs are chosen or elected, but if they are chosen through an electoral process, that I think matters to the public. I think it would be asking quite a lot of the public to understand the minutiae of parliamentary procedure, and I think sort of the broad principles, I think, are something that should be echoed. And I think in our written evidence, we put forward 5 reasons why those chair elections are beneficial. And one of them is to just return to some of the points that Meg made around the legitimacy of the role of MPs as chairs, sort of giving them sort of a house role, and another one around strengthening the independence and impact of committees in the eyes of the public. And I think that's really important. And I think there's 3 other factors that we talked about which draw on Stephen's research. So I wanted to hand over to you.
Yeah, thanks. So the other ones is the introduction of elections has been good for female candidates. So prior to elections, female MPs were underrepresented at chair level, and the introduction of elections has made a difference to that, and it's basically the issue has disappeared in the 15 years since. There's quite a lot of evidence that made a difference. Secondly, that since there's been elections, the newsworthiness of select committees has increased. So MPs or select committee chairs and members are communicating more with the public, and a couple of the core tasks are about communicating with the public, informing the public, and so that increased newsworthiness has allowed select committees to do those core tasks better, arguably. And thirdly, you have to, I'm saying this a little bit carefully because it's unpublished research at the moment, so it hasn't been peer reviewed, but some work that I've been doing with colleagues looked at the impact of the elections on the specialisation of MPs, the levels of specialisation that MPs had in the House. And there's some evidence to suggest that those, the introduction of elections increased the specialisation levels of MPs, perhaps albeit temporarily, but there is a suggestion that in the 2010-2015 election especially there was increased levels of specialisation which can't be put down to things like turnover, things like that, but rather the elections of chairs and members.
Can I just expand a little bit on the point that Gavin was making? As you may know, I was a member of the Scottish Parliament for 10 years, and the Scottish Parliament, the committee chairs are appointed by the party leadership, the government, or the party whips, and as the chief whip for the Scottish Conservatives, one of my jobs was to appoint the committee chairs. You probably are aware of the speculation and rumour there was around this place after the last election. A number of long-serving shadow ministers who'd served for Labour in opposition were passed over for government positions, but the deal was they were promised that the whipping machine of the government would ensure they became committee chairs. Do you have any sort of insights on that in terms of, particularly perhaps to you, Professor Russell, just in terms of, I mean, is it genuinely a free decision of MPs, or do you think there's a whipping operation, and like what described as something to give people as part of the payroll?
Well, I'm flattered that you think that I've got something to tell you about that, but you are the people who participate in these elections, so perhaps you're better qualified to say what kind of pressures you might or might not come under from the whips. I mean, I'm inclined to say, I think there are things, we might come on to this when we're talking about competitiveness and things. There are things that are quite particular about this Parliament. You know, the very high turnover at this election may have led to a lot of people coming in who are relatively less familiar with the system, relatively less confident to challenge instructions given to them by the whips and so on. When turnover is lower and there are more old-timers, it's perhaps easier to, for people to ignore those kinds of suggestions. At the end of the day, I don't want to give the impression that I think... I was once accused in front of a Procedure Committee inquiry some 10 years ago, I think. I was appearing with Tony Wright, so it was... we were both accused equally of wanting to turn Parliament into an academic seminar, which I thought was rather unfair. I don't think this is a technocratic place where, everything runs along kind of strictly neutral and impartial lines. I think you can't take the politics out of politics. Whatever the system is, the parties, the whips, backbench factions and so on are going to try and use the system to their advantage. So I don't think you can stop that kind of thing. But if members don't want people who've just come off the front bench being elected to chair select committees, they don't have to vote for them.
I mean, there's perhaps a difference between, like previously there was formal control over who became chair by party whips, and there may be a shift towards informal control in some ways. But in terms of like anecdotes, I heard that there was, for one particular committee, there was a preferred candidate, and that preferred candidate didn't win. So, that it obviously didn't work in that instance. And then just going back to the previous, like in the last Parliament, there were a lot of select committee chairs, opposition select committee chairs, who then went onto the front bench. So the idea that the weakest, obviously the party leaders didn't think that the weakest link was chairing those. So I'm not entirely sure about the opposition weakest link.
I wasn't making the point about the weakest link. I was more making the point that actually being a committee chair becomes one of the appointments that the whips control and can be offered to colleagues. As
I'm sure that might happen, but I think there's an issue as well as membership as well, whether whips control access to membership of committees rather than the chairships, where the process is very opaque and there's not much information out there about what goes on. At least with the chair elections, you know who the nominees are. There's canvassing, which there may be too much canvassing, but there is canvassing, and there's a public vote that is reported. That doesn't happen with membership elections, and from my perspective, it's probably there that attention needs to be placed rather than at chairship level.
Thank you.
I would agree with that, and I don't know whether we've got time to discuss it later, but that was in our written evidence, the concerns about membership. I mean, basically, our evidence, we feel that the chair elections work pretty well. We might talk about canvassing and things, but the use of the system and so on works pretty well. The member elections are somewhat more problematic, and I think would deserve a bit more scrutiny.
Mary.
Thank you, Chair. And this is a question for Morgan Stephen. Could you explain how the competitiveness of the Select Committee's chairs may seem to have risen recently?
Yeah, okay.
And on that as well, do you think there are other drivers at play here other than the fact that some of the incumbents chose to step down in 2024?
Yeah, so in terms of competitiveness, I think as we say, and also Meg says in her evidence, it depends on how you define competitiveness. So in terms of the number of contested elections, then 2024 was the most competitive. But if you look at the number of MPs who stood in total, and then the narrowness of the winning margin, then 2024 wasn't the most competitive. But in terms of the number of contested and uncontested elections, 2024 was the most competitive in that regard. I think it was mainly down to the fact that, firstly, there weren't many incumbents standing again. There was only 3 for the particular committee that they were chairing. There was other MPs who were previously chair of other committees who were standing for a different committee, like the chair of this committee. But there weren't many incumbents, and also there was a lot of switching from Conservative SNP chairing of particular committees to Labour and Liberal Democrats. So I think those are the issues which perhaps led to it being more competitive in terms of contested or uncontested seats.
I think that Stephen's covered what we're going to say. I suppose the other point I would make is that it perhaps also reflects the growing prestige of committees, that these are sought after posts, and that might also explain why increasingly people do want to go for these positions as well.
Yeah, I mean, the other slightly more cynical thing that I perhaps should have said was that I felt that some MPs from the most recent intake were not standing in order to win, but were standing in order to raise their profile within the House. And given the fact that none of them, apart from the ones where it had to be a new MP, given that none of them won, then that perhaps bears that out a little bit.
Sorry.
Another way of looking at competitiveness, which is reflected in our evidence, is how many people are standing per committee, and that hasn't really changed very much. If you look back over the 5 elections, I make it 51 people standing. The number of committees has slightly fluctuated, but 51 people stood in 2024, 52 in 2019 and 2017. And then there were 61 in 2015, which is maybe, there may be reasons for that, and then 57 in 2010. So the number of people standing for these elections has been fairly stable, actually. Sometimes you've had more uncontested elections, particularly in 2017, which was an election where sort of not a great deal changed in terms of the composition of the House, and it had obviously just been a short parliament beforehand, so that makes some sense. And then at times there have been ones that have had sort of 6 people standing. But generally the number of people standing per position is about 2, if you average it out in every one of these elections.
I'm a 2019 intake, and it must have passed me by. The election, which I've never seen anything like it in 2024. It could have been that there was just a small intake of Labour MPs, and it was COVID. So that canvassing period really didn't happen. But 2024, crikey, I think there were some of us older ones thinking the confidence of these newbies going for select committee chairs. But I agree, it could be to raise their profiles.
Just the other thing that to say about competitiveness is that I think we both feel that there's an issue with competitiveness around third-party chaired committees. So since 2010, I think there's only been one SNP committee where the chairship has been contested, and for Liberal Democrats there hasn't been any. And I was slightly surprised when the Liberal Democrats announced their front bench, their press release, that it included reference to the chairs of their select committees, which seemed to be slightly conflating party activity with parliamentary activity.
Interesting.
Lee?
Yeah, as well, I was going to just build on something you said, Professor Russell, in terms of if you looked at competitiveness through the eyes of, or the lens that you've just talked about in terms of looking over the trends over a number of years and the actual numbers, if that has remained pretty stable or even declined, do you think that's a worrying trend for us that we need to be looking at? Is that a concern to you?
Not really. No. I mean, I think I think the elections have always run pretty well, and they continue to run well, and they vary according to whether it's a large turnover election and so on. There are factors that contextual factors that make them run differently. Yeah. And one of the ones which you emphasised in your evidence, didn't you? I don't want to steal your point. Is about the campaign period. The length of the campaign period this time, which may be a contributor alongside other things to the increased campaign materials and so on.
John?
It was just to follow up on your point you made about the SNP and Lib Dems. I mean, is that not them just circumventing the rules of the House? Because my understanding is they have their own internal contest, pick the person that they want, and they're not getting the judgment of the rest of the members of Parliament as to who we want as chair of that committee.
I mean, I don't know if it's circumventing the rules or not, but
Spirit. That's effectively what they're doing. So it's, so
on democratic parties.
There may be reasons why the third party, because of the relatively small number of MPs, it may be that there is not the sort of competitiveness, the possibility of competitiveness within that.
There is a contest. Just to be clear, my understanding is there is a contest, certainly with the SNP, there is a contest happening, but they do it behind closed doors amongst their MPs, as opposed to all MPs getting to choose.
That doesn't seem to be, because it's a parliamentary committee, isn't it? And it should be elected by the whole House. That's the,
And that's something we can seek further evidence on. I'm conscious that we don't have any third-party MPs here to defend themselves.
I think a question there would be what, if any, sanctions there are against people who don't respect that election, because, of course, according to the rules of the House, somebody who hadn't been elected inside the party has the right to put themselves forward. But the party might well be able to make their life very difficult if they did so.
Which is, I think, with my understanding, what happened with the SNP in the last Parliament. Certainly there was a couple of candidates who would have gone forward to a full election of the House, and sufficient pressure or the internal contest happened to ensure that only one candidate was put forward for ratification, which is obviously, as Gavin says, not within the spirit of the rules.
Interesting question for the Procedure Committee, what the rules could do to prevent that kind of behaviour.
This is one of the challenges that we have, is that there's House rules for elections, but then political parties obviously elect members for committees, not chairs, and those processes are sometimes less transparent than the elections for chairs, shall we say. James?
Yes, so we'll have a look at, we've started to touch on this canvassing and the electioneering in the chair's elections, which I think was a delight for all of us. We all know how it feels to live in a parliamentary by-election in terms of leaflets. But this is mainly to Stephen and to Mark. So following the election last year, we had a kind of uniquely long campaign period between the announcement of the party chair allocations and the elections taking place. And if you could tell us what impact you think that had, and just as a sort of supplementary, because I suspect you may touch on it, your evidence, the written evidence, suggests a kind of 10-day working time fixed gap between the announcement and the elections. And could you kind of give us a view of the rationale of that and how you think it kind of ties in?
Yes, sure. So I think the reasoning behind the 10 working days is because that reflects sort of what tends to happen in practice in previous elections. And I think that this time round, or in 2024, that was where the outlier was. And I think if you give MPs an entire summer to run an election campaign and nothing else to do, then maybe that's what they're going to spend their energies on. So I think that might explain why there was more intense canvassing over that period. If it's a quiet summer, then it doesn't give them much else. So for that reason, we think that reducing the time period in line with what's standard practice, so we've put it as 10 working days or 14 calendar days, was the practice in 2010 and in 2015, and I think also in 2017. And I think that that's something that should be something that we recommend could be done in the future. For consistency reasons, it gives greater transparency for this process, and helps perhaps minimise some of that canvassing that some MPs have complained about.
And do you think there'd be any risks with a fixed term? I mean, it sounds like not, but I'll give you the chance if you think they're putting it as a sort of determined period, whether there's any risks associated with that.
I wouldn't say so. There are some. I looked through the written evidence from some of the MPs that wrote to the committee who might be concerned that it would reduce opportunities for canvassing, and therefore some MPs might not be aware of who's running for these elections. But I think that's a minimal risk, I would say.
So Christopher.
Can I ask a more basic question to start off with, and that is that Meg was talking about the good old days. I mean, I can remember when I first arrived in this place in 1983 that the then member for Gosport spent an inordinate amount of time canvassing my support for he to be the chairman of the Defence Committee. And I couldn't get a word in edgeways, but at the end of his case, he said, I said to him, I didn't think that people who weren't on the committee had a vote on who should chair it. And he said to me, "You are Edward Lee, aren't you?" To which I assured him I wasn't. And then he left. I've never seen anybody depart so quickly, because he had a relatively small number of people from whom to choose. And so the previous system may not have been perfect, but what it did was ensure that the members of a committee could choose their chair. And taking into account that one of the big frustrations at the beginning of any parliament is that it takes a long time to set up the select committees, would it not be better to revert to a system whereby we had the elections within the parties for the membership of the committees, and prior to that the government would have announced which committees would have a Labour chairman and so on, and then within the parties, people would compete amongst themselves to be their party representatives on those committees. And then at the first meeting of that committee, the members of the committee would choose who would be the chair, taking into account that the chair may have been allocated to a particular political party. And in that way, we would then get not only the best people going on, and the keenest people going on to the committees, but we'd also ensure that we maintained that principle that it's important that the members of the committee themselves should have confidence in the chair, rather than, in a sense, having that chair imposed on them. And I pray and aid in this proposition what happened on the Intelligence and Security Committee when the members had been appointed by the government and opposition patronage secretaries, but the members themselves decided that they thought that, in this particular example, Julian Lewis would be a much better chair of their committee than somebody who'd been identified in advance as the government's chosen person. And that was an example of where the committee itself chose its chair. The consequence for Julian Lewis was that his knighthood was delayed, stopped, and then subsequently reinstated much later on. But it meant that the committee had a chair of its own choice and liking. So why are we sort of thinking about the current system without thinking about the virtues of having a committee that is actually chosen by its own membership, removing ourselves from the situation where, as in quite a lot of the patronage secretary would say, well, you're going to be on this committee. We can now have elections of the committees, but the committees, once elected, would elect their chairs.
Did you want me to take?
Whoever wants to pick that up.
No, I'm happy to say that. Well, I could say I can remember because I was there. I was there, but I wouldn't probably have remembered unless I'd reread bits of the report before coming here, that the Right Committee did consider all of these options. You can see them set out in the report, that there are various ways of doing it. One way would be to elect the members and then have the committees elect the chairs, or you elect the chairs and then elect the members afterwards. And there were various combinations considered. The Intelligence and Security Committee, of course, is one remaining under something more like the old system, and that's the kind of problem that you had with the old system. The system you're suggesting is not the old system. You're suggesting election of members, which is an interesting proposition. I think it would take us back to how are the members elected, and I would say that the Right Committee wanted members to be elected by a transparent democratic system. It actually wanted to be those elections to be kite marked by the Speaker. The kite marking by the Speaker was never implemented, but the motion that the House agreed did say, where's the wording, that the party should elect members by secret ballot in a transparent and using a transparent and democratic method. I don't think the method is at all transparent. We don't know what goes on in terms of the election of members, and I don't think the system is operating in line with the motion that the House agreed, implementing the Right Committee's recommendations in 2010. So I've managed to get that point in. Unless you're going to sort that out,
so
I don't
is that
think
something for this committee to look at in this inquiry, do you think? That particular failure?
I think it should be. I think it should be. But certainly I don't think that I wouldn't endorse a system where committees are choosing their chairs until you'd sorted out whether those elections of members were genuinely transparent. I would also say in response to you, because the Right Committee did consider this, you used the word chair imposed on them. It was very explicit that because the chairs were chosen first and the outcome of the chair elections was announced before member elections opened, people did not have somebody imposed on them. They had to decide whether they wanted to serve on a committee chaired by that person. I know sometimes you'd want to be on a committee, but you wouldn't like the chair, and that would present you with a dilemma. But they're not really imposed on them. They do know in advance.
Yeah, but, the example I was taking was the Intelligence and Security Committee, where it was quite clear that there was pressure on the government members on that committee who were appointed to choose another government supporting member other than Julian Lewis.
That seems to me to be an argument against the old system, pre-Right Committee,
yes, exactly.
rather than
it's an argument against that
system.
system, but it's not necessarily an argument against the revised system I've been describing.
Thank you.
So having said all that, did I have another question?
I thought you were going to ask.
But I think that can I also say you talk about this issue of canvassing, and it seems to me, and I think this is the point that's coming out already, is that at the last general election, how many? I didn't know many of my new colleagues, there are only 25 of them. I certainly didn't know any of the new hordes who were then on the government benches. And yet the system required us to make intelligent choices as to who we wanted to have as the chairs of these committees. And I thought it was good that the potential candidates set out their stalls and allowed themselves to be made available for questions and so on. And so wasn't the length of time all that took a consequence of the fact that people didn't know each other and they were modest enough to recognise people didn't know them? And should that be a subject of criticism that canvassing took place and or that it took so long?
I don't think it's necessarily a criticism, and certainly that's a benefit of having a longer electoral period. But I suppose you could organise that in different ways. You could have, for example, hustings specific for each committee, where everybody is able to set out their stalls, which would then prevent everyone receiving several phone calls or several leaflets through their door, or having door-to-door canvassing. If you had sort of those meetings and those committees that you're interested in, then that would perhaps be more time efficient.
I mean, I slightly disagree with Matt there. I mean, one of the MPs, I think it was Toby Perkins, in his written evidence said that nobody will attend the hustings. And I think I would agree with that. If there's like 25 elections, I mean, what MP has got the time to go to all 25 of those? So either you take 2 days out of your working week to go to every husting, or you just go to the one you're interested in, where there's going to be 10 other people there, and that's not a good way of getting. It's not a good use of anyone's time. I don't think. I mean, so I think there's probably an issue of what rules should there be about how much canvassing, etc., should be done. I mean, there's rules in every workplace about that kind of thing. At our university, when there's elections for Senate, you make a 250-word statement, and then people vote on the basis of that. And I didn't go around putting leaflets under people's doors or anything like that. So there's ways of doing it. I think it's like allowing fairness in the system, and also recognising that MPs are very busy people.
And there is a candidates booklet for the Select Committee Chair elections, and we have, as part of our work on this inquiry, seen that, and I think there was an understanding that not many members were aware of it. So I wondered whether or not either of any of you three were aware of the candidate booklet from the outside looking in, because certainly from the inside it was not well known about.
Yeah, we read it.
We are not typical members of the public. Again, I think that it's very nice that you're asking us these questions, but you're the ones best positioned to judge whether there was too much or too little canvassing, and whether there ought to be limits put on it. I was very struck by some of that written evidence that you received from people who took part in the elections. Using words like excessive, deluged and intolerable, but they weren't all unanimous in their view. There's clearly different views in here, and I don't know whether you're going to be asking members as a whole how deluged they felt, but this is really a question that I think only you can answer in here. Us sitting on the outside will look at the answers with interest, but we're not really qualified to adjudicate, I think.
Absolutely fair point. Sir Gavin, you had some questions.
Thank you ever so much. Meg, so your written evidence suggests a sort of competitiveness is unlikely to be the driver of increased campaigning, but sort of rather, do you think it's because the roles of select committee chairs have become more established, people have got more comfortable with what they are, or they see it as a sort of a better or career route?
You mean in terms of what happened the last time? In terms
yes.
of, yeah, I think it's the product of a fairly unusual constellation of circumstances, which doesn't mean it won't happen again. And the timing that was referred to before, which was caused by a July general election, we haven't actually had one of those I haven't mugged up. I think we have had one once before, but not for a very, very long time. Yeah. So the recess arrived before the elections could take place, and that clearly influenced things. And on top of that, you had a huge, an unprecedentedly high number of new MPs who didn't know the candidates, and a number of new candidates. So I'm not sure that it would be repeated, but I also think it might be complacent to say that what happened last time, you'll revert to what happened in 2019, say, at the next election, because I think once an election has happened where there's a lot of leafleting, a lot of campaigning, a lot of emails being sent out, there is a risk that sets a precedent and it's sort of ratcheted up, even if those conditions don't apply next time. So I think that might be a reason for looking at limits.
Mark and Stephen, do you think sort of like the elections have... do you think you've created, through the elections, not you created, but you've created like super parliamentarians, obviously that's how we refer to our chair, but do you think they've sort of, it's given them a prominence that they didn't previously had? I mean, we're talking about Gwyneth Dunwoody and various others who were actually quite prominent parliamentarians and used actually the select committee system. But do you think the elections have elevated people, or do you think it really comes down to the individual as to how much elevation they get, not as to whether they've been elected or not?
I mean, so I think it has increased the prominence of select committees more generally, and chairs in particular, since the elections. Whether that means that chairs are super parliamentarians or not is a different matter. I mean, I did a little bit of work looking at kind of like career paths of chairs, and you've, over the last 2 or 3 parliaments, you've had an increase in, or there's like the emergence of people using select committee chairs as a stepping stone. So you've seen quite a few relatively new MPs chairing quite prominent committees, and then being promoted to the front bench relatively quickly. And you've also seen MPs use chairships. I mean, it's not quite the right term, but like as treading water. So they've been ministers or shadow ministers, then for one reason or another, to do with Brexit or to do with Corbyn becoming leader or whatever, their normal career path has not you know,
there's been disruption.
There's been disruption, yes, on both parties, and so then you've had people being chairs of committees who you would perhaps normally expect to be on the front bench, who have subsequently gone back onto the front bench, and that's a bit different from the sort of like super parliamentarian. Like, here's another career path. If you don't want to be on the front bench, then you can have a career path as being like the end point is becoming a chair of a committee, or you know, you were on the front bench and now as part of your swan song you're going to chair a committee. That is like like traditionally what chairing a committee was like, and then there seems to be the emergence, as I said, of these two other kind of like career pathways.
I think just to echo an earlier point as well, a lot of chairs perceive their role to be a house-wide role, and I think that changes their own sort of sense of purpose and sort of the kinds of activities that they do. So I think from that point of view as well, sort of the role of a chair has far greater prestige than perhaps in the past.
James.
I think aimed at probably mainly to Meg this, but do you have any views on whether all the chair posts should be part of the process of being elected at the start of a parliament? For example, so take something like the chair of the Backbench Business Committee, whether that should be elected to serve for the whole parliament or continue to be elected on a sessional basis.
Okay, that's an interesting one. I think we may have struggled slightly to interpret your question about whether all chairs should be elected, because it could be interpreted as, should there be fewer or should there be more? I don't think any of us believe that there should be fewer committees with elected chairs, but there are some around the edges that don't currently have elected chairs that maybe it could be extended to. But I thought it was very interesting in your, again, in the evidence from members who had contested the elections, that somebody raised the question of the liaison committee, which I think did elect its own chair in line with what Sir Christopher was saying this time, but didn't the previous time when Bernard Jenkin, who I think did a very good job as chair, and was maybe aware of the need to prove himself as an independent voice, having effectively been parachuted in by the Prime Minister to chair the liaison committee. So I think there are some questions about other chairs. The Backbench Business Committee is an interesting one. I confess I'm quite closely interested in the Backbench Business Committee, and was obviously there at its creation. I don't know how that ended up being sessionally elected rather than elected for the Parliament. I do find that quite peculiar. I don't have a particularly strong view as to whether it should change. There is a problem with the Backbench Business Committee, again, in terms of election of members, that the recommendation of the Right Committee was that those members should exceptionally be elected across the House, unlike the members of other committees that are elected in their parties, and that was initially the case. But again, a surprise motion from the government that nobody was expecting changed that pretty much overnight, and they gained approval for that. So I've separately written evidence for the Backbench Business Committee is inquiring into its own operation after 15 years. And one of the things that we've said is it's a long time since that change happened, but it would be better to revert to the principle of being elected across the House. So it is a different committee to others. I don't have a strong view about the chair. I don't know whether anybody else does.
Gurinder.
Thank you. Professor Russell, the Constitutional Unit written evidence alludes to the potential merits of periodic reviews of Select Committee chair election. Are there any particular elements of that you think should be monitored or reviewed each time?
It would be interesting to hear from the others who've done such careful research about these elections, how easy it is to get information about the elections, because I found it quite difficult looking. I don't believe there is a publication that says this many people stood for this many committees, this many votes were cast, and so on, that would make it easy to track issues like competitiveness. I mainly made that point because I was concerned about the lack of transparency over election of members, and because the election of members is not specified. There's a very high level of specification of the election of chairs in standing orders. So, those are followed. Clearly, they're followed by the House authorities. It would be a breach of standing orders not to. There's not even a mention that members of select committees are elected in standing orders. There's not a list of which members will be elected, and there's not an indication of what electoral systems were used or how many candidates stood. So with respect to select committee chairs, it's very transparent and it's very it's very closely laid down, and there is publicity about it, but I still think it's somewhat scattered, and Stephen and Mark might want to comment on that. And with respect to members, there is nothing, and my suggestion was if this isn't going to be governed by standing orders, then perhaps this committee could take it upon itself to report on the election of members by parties. Or you might think somebody else should be doing that, but I think somebody should do it, because I think currently it is in breach of what the House agreed in 2010, and it's definitely in breach of what the Right Committee recommended.
I mean, on the point of election of members, I tried to do research on that in the past, but I got nowhere because there was no information at all. And when I once inquired into it, I was told these are internal party matters, and wasn't given any further information.
Yeah, ditto. I mean, that's what the experience I've had. I mean, so in terms of collecting data for chair elections, I found it relatively easy because I now know where to look. But I think if you're coming to it cold, there's not like a central repository. The other thing that I thought could perhaps be done, which again, I mean, refers to members. So in terms of gender and ethnicity, committees are doing pretty well overall. But in the last election, there were issues, I think, with like geographical representation on certain committees, where the old system may have been better at doing that, because you think, okay, well, we need to have someone from different regions. So I think, from memory, I think like the Treasury Select Committee is very London heavy. I don't think any Scottish MP is on the Defence Committee. I think that's right, from memory. So there are issues. So some like monitoring of who the members are, and that's not then saying you've got to. That's not saying you must do something about it, but it gives information to the electors, the MPs who are electing, to say, okay, well, I need to consider who I'm voting for in terms of like geographical representation, as well as other reasons why I may or may not be voting for someone, if those elections do actually take place.
So how much of that, if that information was available, how much of that do you think is a reflection of the particular parliament? So, you know, with this parliament, there was a lot of vacancies, there was a lot of new members elected for the first time, there's a big change in government, and that obviously would have flavoured what happened. You know, you've already detailed some of that. And so every parliament will be very different. So how much of that, if you did have that information, how much of it would be actually flavoured by the actual peculiarities of that particular parliament?
I mean, the only thing I would say is on that is I don't think there's necessarily. So the Parliament is pretty good. It used to be better, but it's still pretty good at publishing sessional returns, which includes a lot of information that is very useful to people. And I wouldn't have thought it would be too difficult, for example, to include details of select committee chair elections in that information, for example, or at least including links. I mean, that seems the way it's gone. It's like, for further details, like of attendance, go to the individual committees, but some committees are better than others at reporting that. But there are there's already ways of doing it that I would have thought could be utilised to make information readily available to anyone who is interested in it.
And of course, this is about trust in the process. Again, this is not about us being able to get easy information so that we can write nice research publications. This is about transparency of Parliament for the public, and them having trust that actually rules are being followed and that transparent and democratic processes are taking place. And I think you can see that if you look carefully for the select committee elections, but as Stephen says, you know where to go and get the information, but if a member of the public wanted to see, well, how did those elections go, it wouldn't be so straightforward to find that. And I think that's a shame, because it's all done perfectly properly and the information is there, it's just not pulled together. And for select committee members, I think even we don't really have confidence that the system is working properly, and there's no reason for members of the public to have confidence that it's working properly.
Can it not be argued that because the results of the individual parties choosing the members for each select committee, those results are then reported to the House by the Committee of Selection, and there's a motion on the order paper, which normally goes through unamended and on the nod, could it not be said that there is a power of the House to actually force a change and have a different outcome, irrespective of what has come from the individual parties, in the same way as the House can amend a recommendation for membership of a joint committee, for example, that the usual channels will have put that list together, but as I know from experience, if you cause trouble and you put down some amendments, quite often you can get a change of view. Do you think, and I think particularly looking at Meg on this, because she's opined on it, but do you think that the power of the House to oversee this process to a greater extent and insist on more transparency, that is already there, but it's just not being used?
I think that's a slightly different question. I think the House is very powerful when it wants to use its powers. The extent to which I suspect it can't now throw out who the select committee chairs are, because that's all specified. But when it comes to the members, you may well be correct that it could still do that. And that's effectively what happened with Donald Anderson and Gwyneth Dunwoody when the lists were thrown out. But on the 4th of March 2010, the House passed a motion that this House takes note of the recommendations of the Right Committee and endorses the principle that parties should elect members of select committees in a secret ballot by whichever transparent and democratic method they choose. So what you say may or may not be true, but that motion is not being, this is not a transparent process. It may be a democratic process, we don't really know because it's not transparent. Certainly not a transparent process. That's the point that I'm making.
Thank you.
Thank you for your evidence that you've given us on select committee chairs. The inquiry that we're doing is slightly more broader because we are covering the elections for deputy speakers. It was just on the off chance that any of you had any comments you'd like to make on the elections of deputy speakers. I thought I'd give you the opportunity before I draw our proceedings to a close. I don't know if anybody has anything to add to that. No. Well, if there is anything that you want to add to the evidence that you've given us this afternoon, obviously we're very happy to receive anything in writing. And with no further questions, I draw this session to a close.